To our October live stream. Really excited about this one. As I've mentioned before, we're going to be talking about all the bread problems. It seems like every live video I do, almost every video I do, I always get questions about common bread issues. So we're going to be focusing on that today. But first, before we dive in, just want to say welcome to everyone and thank you to all of you who reached out to me about Hurricane Ian. As many of y'all know, I am in Florida, and that was definitely headed for where I live, but we did not get hit. But many prayers for my fellow Floridians, because where it did hit was really bad, very devastating. I know people who live in the South Florida area. I know people who have family down there. So it's going to take a while to rebuild, but thankfully for us where we live, we definitely had our eye on it, but we weren't affected. I didn't even have any rain. We had wind, but we didn't even have any rain. So thank you everyone to reach out to me for that. So a couple of things is, first of all, if you were here for our last live, the internet did cut out. If that happens again, I do try to get back on as soon as possible. So just hang on here because it does restart this broadcast. If that happens again, hopefully it will not this time. All right. And also leave your questions, especially dealing with, any bread problems, things like that. We will be addressing a ton of them, but do know if it's like all the other lives, the comments get a little crazy. It's a little hard for me to read all of them. So super chat is a guaranteed way that if you have a question you really want answered, then you can leave a super chat. It's that $sign that you see below the chat here. And then with that, it'll actually feature your question and I'll be sure to answer that. But otherwise, I'm going to try to hit all the common bread problems today, as well as answer any of y'all's question. All right, so we have some people on. We got people from Northern California, way on the other side of the country. So welcome everyone who is here. All right, so today, the common issues we are going to be talking about. We're first going to be talking about the big one that I've been receiving a lot, which is crumbly bread. If your bread is really crumbly, we're going to be talking about that today, as well as bread not rising, bread splitting on the top when baked. Also talk about dense bread issues. If your dough is too sticky, talking about that. And then I've also been getting a couple of questions about bread being a bit gritty. So I'm going to discuss that as well, and anything else that may pop up in the comments or in my head while we do this. So we got people from all over here at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, Indiana, North Mississippi, Australia. You win for the distance. So welcome. I don't even know what time it is in Australia. That's on the complete opposite side. Goodness. All righty. So I know that we have a lot of newbies who've recently found me, and a lot of these questions I am receiving more and more. So let's just do a video to hopefully help you guys out. All righty. So I have Darren says, I need help. I've just started milling my own flour, but I'm making bricks rather than a nice airy loaf. I feel ya. Been there. It's frustrating. So hopefully this will help. Okay, 12 p.m. in Australia. Okay, I think is it Friday for you? Because it's Thursday here, 9 p.m. Eastern time, Thursday, 11 in the morning in Australia. Good heavens. Well, welcome and good morning to you. All right. So first of all, let's talk about crumbly bread. That is a huge one that I receive. So how to troubleshoot if your bread is just basically falling apart, or it's just a lot of crumbs or too crumbly. And there's a lot to this issue. So what I may say may not address it at all. These are just things that I've noticed, that I've tweaked, and hopefully will help you guys. So first of all, You do need to understand that working with freshly milled flour with bread baked from home, it is going to be different than store-bought bread. Remember, I think a lot of us are used to store-bought bread where it's already sliced from the store. They add a lot of things to it to make it, not crumble, to make it smooth and light and fluffy and all of those things. So just remember that this is going to be different than store-bought flour. That's a good thing. We want that. And now it shouldn't be falling apart. But just remember that if you are expecting store-bought bread type smoothness and no crumble at all, just remember that is made with different flour and it is just different with a lot of stuff in it. Okay, so that's the first thing to consider. The second thing, big thing, is make sure when you are slicing into your bread that you are using an actual bread knife. I have found that if I just use a regular serrated knife, it does crumble the bread more than an actual bread knife. I don't really have any one particular bread knife that I highly recommend. It's just, I do have one, I think I linked up in my Amazon storefront, but really, I mean, my bread knife is a Cutco bread knife, which is a good brand, but I got it for $1 at a flea market. So, just get you a bread knife as opposed to a serrated knife. So that's the big thing. And a lot of times that does fix a lot of the crumbling bread problems, is if you're using there's a reason we have bread knives. It helps the bread not to crumble. It helps it to slice better. Third thing to consider is, how are you storing the bread? Obviously, bread will crumble more the more that it dries out. And I did do a video a while back all about how I like to store my bread. It kind of changes, to be honest. I might find a way that works better. It depends on the time of year. I am in Florida. We do have more humidity in the air. So this may be different for someone who's who lives in a drier climate. I don't know. But bottom line, I have found that my favorite ways to store my bread is either in a plastic Ziploc bag, or I actually now have a really big Rubbermaid container. Think Tupperware, but it's a big one that seals very well, basically airtight, and that actually keeps my bread. It doesn't dry it out for longer. So that really helps, because again, I do notice that the drier the bread, the more crumbly it's going to be. So if you're not noticing crumbly bread, the day that you bake it or the next day, it's possible that your bread is just drying out, thus crumbling a bit more. So hopefully that helps. Now, here's a little confession that I have noticed recently, and this is to deal with my my simple yeast bread loaf recipe. I do actually plan on remaking that video soon, because I've actually tweaked a few things with that. And that's mainly to make smaller loaves. So my simple yeast bread recipe, I have on my website. It was my very first video I posted to YouTube. It's gotten a lot of views. I've heard a lot of great things about it, but it does make a very large 2-pound loaf. And I have noticed that even for me, with my large 2-pound loaves, that it kind of crumbles, or tends to have a bit more crumble to it than if I made it a smaller 1-pound loaf. Now, to make it pretty simple, I just half the dough to make it a 1-pound loaf instead of a 2-pound loaf. And I have found that with it not being so tall of a loaf, with it being a bit shorter, still shaped well, but just a 1-pound loaf or 1.5-pound loaf actually is sometimes what it ends up being. I've noticed that it just comes together a bit better. It stays together better, not being dense. But when I slice it, I have noticed a bit less crumble with a smaller loaf. So that's something to consider. And again, I do plan on remaking that video to kind of show you my updated process with baking bread. So it's still a good recipe. I have not tweaked the actual recipe. I just may do smaller loaves instead of the large 2-pound loaves. So something to consider. Now, if you're wanting to know, now I have had this question, kind of a side note, but related. For those who only want to make a one loaf, or maybe you need to triple it, remember that I do have a free quick ingredients cheat sheet for you guys. It's something that I hang up on my fridge right next to my baking station. And all this is just list the ingredients for my most common recipes. So obviously my bread, but muffins, pancakes, biscuits, pie crust. So I don't have to constantly find my notes for that. It doesn't have the full recipe on it, but we do link it in here, and you can just sign up for my newsletter. I'll try to link it here for you guys, my free that ingredients quick cheat sheet type thing. And if you grab that, it actually has on there the ingredients for 1 loaf, 2 loaves, or 3 loaves on there. So that way you don't have to do mental math if you're wanting to cut the recipe in half. So that's there for you. And again, I generally have it in my description box. You can find it on my website under freebies, and I'll try to link it here as well in the comments. But that's something that you can do. Just remember that my recipe easily can double, triple, or cut in half. But if you're still having trouble with crumbly bread after all these recommendations that I have, and if you're making a 2-pound loaf, try to make a bit smaller of a loaf and see if you still have the same issues. So hopefully that helps you guys out with the crumbly, if you notice a bit more crumbly bread. Okay, so hello from Miss Barbara. He's here. Hello from a fellow Floridian. Hey, hopefully you are fine with the hurricane as well. Okay, let's see. We have a couple of questions already. If Pamela says, if I want to mix different grains for bread, what kind of ratio of ancient grains like einkorn or kamut or spelt to hard red wheat will work? From Tennessee, thanks. Oh, very good question. So with the ancient grains, remember that ancient grains generally do not have as strong of a gluten content as our hard red or hard white wheat. I have done half. Did I do half spelt? No, I think I've done about 1/3 spelt to 2/3 hard red. And that is actually very delicious. Still gives a good rise. And that spelt gives it a really good taste and texture. And I would probably do that same ratio. Start with about 1/3 of the ancient grain and then 2/3 of the hard red. And then experiment half and half. See how that goes. But that's the ratio that I would start with, is basically a 1 to 3. 1/3 of the ancient grain, 2/3 of the hard red or hard white. So hopefully that helps you guys. Okay, another question real quick. Herbs seasoning, at what point do you introduce these in the dough making / bread making point? So rosemary, basil, garlic, so forth. That's actually a really good question, because I have not really incorporated these into the actual loaf before. But usually, I assume you're talking about a loaf, just a basic loaf bread. And so to take my recipe where we mill the flour, we then proof the yeast, and then we add in our flour, and then we start getting where that dough is coming together. I personally would probably add it whenever the dough is partially, like halfway come together, or to the point where you've added enough flour, you're now just adding in those extra things. But I think it would just depend. I would only save dried herbs for kind of the closer to the end, when you're about to start the kneading process. Hopefully that makes sense. And I'm going off a gut feeling here. Okay, so next up, big bread problem is the bread not rising. So this, again, several things. First of all, the biggest one is, this is why I recommend proofing your yeast, whether it is instant yeast or active dry yeast. Now, instant yeast, you can usually get away with without proofing it. But if you're using active dry yeast, I would definitely proof it to get it active, no pun intended, to get it to get it going. And then, but it also not only gets it going, but it also lets you know if your yeast is bad. So if your bread is not rising, it is possible you just have bad yeast, and you can catch it in the proofing process if it's not bubbling up fairly well. That's usually an indication you might have some iffy yeast there, and I would start it over. So that's the first thing, is make sure you have good yeast. Secondly, and this is relevant for this time of year, is it just too cold in your house? Remember, bread likes to rise in warmer environments, not super hot environments, just warm. So if it's really cold in the house, it will still rise, but it's going to take a lot longer to do that. So keep that in mind as well, especially as I've been told some of y'all are dealing with, the colder weather and stuff like that. Now, and number 3 for bread not rising, the biggest thing is use the right kind of wheat. Remember, not all wheat is created equal as far as our yeast breads go. So make sure that, to make it simple, your hard red and your hard white are going to be your best wheats for a typical yeast bread loaf. They have the best gluten structure and content to get that nice rise. So that, especially if you start mixing the grains, say a hard red with the ancient grains that we talked about, it's possible that too much of the ancient grain was added to kind of contradict, to not to keep the bread from rising as well. So that's something to consider, is, again, make sure you're using the right wheat. If you're using a soft white wheat and your bread isn't rising, that's why, because soft white wheat is not the best for yeast bread. So again, hard red and hard white, keep it simple, especially if you're a newbie. Those are going to be your best wheats to use for a typical loaf of bread. And finally, bread not rising. Again, there's so many factors here, but it's possible that you did not knead it enough to activate the gluten. But on the flip side, it's also possible to over knead, thus making it more dense of a dough, which means it's not really going to want to rise. So there's a delicate balance there. And this is where practice, you're just going to have to practice, and more experience will tell you how the dough should feel. So the dough after kneading, it should feel soft. It should feel pliable. Just think of a good dough. I mean, we've kind of all seen things like pizza dough, or, you kind of seen dough and how it just looks kind of smooth and pliable, and you can work with it, things like that. So again, you're just going to have to get your hands on and the experience under your belt to know how it should feel. But if you haven't kneaded it enough, it means the gluten hasn't been activated enough to help it to rise. But don't over knead it. And I know that's really frustrating, because that was really frustrating to me too when I started. So, alrighty. So those are the big things with bread not rising. Another thing, which we may get to at the in this video, about the recipe conversions, because someone just said, today I grinded for the first time hard white wheat. I did a recipe for artisan bread that I always use with store-bought flour. I did not bake it yet. I feel like it won't work. That is another thing to consider, as well, as sometimes whenever you are converting recipes, you're going to have to learn to tweak things to compensate the fact that you're using freshly milled flour as opposed to store-bought flour. It is a different ballgame. It just is. Real food overall, different ballgame. So there are things with that. So that's the other thing, is if bread not rising, any of these problems, if you keep having it, no matter what you tweak, it's possible your recipe is just not working. So that's also something to consider, no matter what your problem is. It may just be just not a good recipe. I mean, bottom line, no offense to people who do recipes. I do them myself, but sometimes a recipe just doesn't work. It just doesn't. So that's something to consider. All right, next one. This is one that I've experienced myself recently, and that's the bread splitting when baked. So, what I mean by this is you have shaped your bread dough. It looks nice, on the top. It rises, but usually you catch this right before it goes into the oven, and you notice like it's split on the top, or you've noticed this after baking that the bread has split on the top. It's no longer smooth. There are two issues with this that I've noticed. The biggest one is if it's not folded correctly, if somehow it's folded and it wasn't as smooth, just it just wasn't folded well. So you're going to have to tweak the folding. This happens to me usually when I'm in a hurry and I'm just quickly folding my bread and putting in the bread pan. And that's when I notice that my bread may split because I was a bit lazy and did not take the time to fold it and treat it nicely. The bread dough likes to be loved. It wants to feel loved and be treated well. We must treat our bread dough well. And when we don't, it sometimes fights back. And this is one way. So if you notice your bread splitting and you're not intending for it to split on the top, check your folding technique. And, you may have to, like me, sometimes have to slow down during the shaping and folding process to make sure that you're doing it right. Okay, so that's just a little thing, bread splitting when baked. Next big thing, dense bread. People ask me this a lot. You bake bread, it comes out like a brick, which is completely heartbreaking when that happens because you do spend time on this and you really get excited and only for it to come out dense. Now, many times when I see some of you guys who mill your wheat and you say that the bread came out dense, that it still tastes good, which is great. But we don't really want to consume dense bread. So here's a few things with the dense bread. First of all, like I said, with the bread not rising, is you may have over kneaded it. So if you knead it too much, and you will know you did based on the feel of the dough. If the dough is already feeling dense and kind of that more of a heavy feeling, and again, experience is going to tell you how this is. That's usually an indication either too much flour was added or it's over kneaded. If the dough itself is feeling dense, you're going to know before you even bake it, it's probably not going to turn out the way that you planned. So that's the biggest thing, is you may have over kneaded it. And then the second thing, like I already mentioned, you may have added too much flour, thus producing a denser dough that thus is going to translate into a denser loaf. So be careful with the kneading. Be careful not to add too much flour. And of course, logically speaking, if it's dense, it may not have risen well, which go back to the information I gave on bread not rising to help to make sure your bread is rising well. Obviously, if the bread doesn't rise, everything's still squished together and you're going to have that denser loaf. And again, as far as the density goes, you're going to know this the more experience you have of how that dough should feel, so you can tweak it before you go through the baking process or start over if you have to. Excuse me. So that's the thing with dense bread. It usually corresponds to a bread not rising very well. So hopefully that helps with dense bread. All right, we have two more issues going on. So the next one is sticky dough. Now, this is one that I'm definitely going to probably talk a bit more whenever I redo my simple yeast bread loaf recipe video, because it has been like a year and a half since I've done it. So I probably will discuss this more in that video. But I have received many comments from people saying, I've added the flour, but it's still just really sticky. And I know that we hesitate to add more flour because we don't want it to be dense. We do want it to be a good dough. Oh, Nated just said, will this live be available after? Yes, it will be. This video will still be on my YouTube channel after we stop going live. So there you go. So how it works with my dough is I actually do wait until, or sorry, I actually do allow my dough to still be a little sticky after the kneading process. I do not add so much flour where there's no stickiness whatsoever. This is going to help you if you have dense bread and your bread is not rising, because again, there is an issue if you add too much flour. So I actually still, even after kneading, my dough is still a little bit sticky. And what I do then is I then just lightly dust my surface that I'm going to shape and cut the dough. So lightly dust it. And then I just put a little bit of flour on my hands. If necessary, sprinkle just a little bit on top, and then handle and shape the dough from there. So basically I'm just getting it to where it's not completely sticking on my hands. This is also why I recommend a scraper, so you can really scrape off that dough without having to add too much flour. So again, this is just, I really wish I could have every single one of you with me in person to discuss how to make bread, because it's just, you'll get a better idea feeling the dough and when you actually feel it, and when you actually have the experience of what it should feel like in person. And that's not something I can communicate over video. But that's the thing, is I do let it be a little sticky, add a little bit of flour at a time. That way my bread doesn't come out dense. It rises well. It's a lighter loaf because I haven't added it. So that's something with the sticky dough. It also will depend. Remember that depending if it's raining, if it's humid, things like that, you may need to add a little bit more flour than you did yesterday. It is something that we don't go by the exact weight or the exact amount of flour every single time. I always go by how it looks and how it feels. I mean, that's how you got to do it. All right, last one. And then I did see some questions that we had. So I've noticed a few people who have stated that they're new to milling. They've made the bread, but it tasted gritty. So there was a grit to that. I do think the main problem with this is the grains are just we're not milled fine enough. Now, if you have an impact mill, this is probably not your problem, because that'll get you fine flour every single time. But if you have a stone mill like the Nutrimil Harvest or the Mock mill, where you actually have to adjust those stones yourself in order to get that fineness, it's just possible you are not milling it fine enough, and thus you have a little bit of grit because it's just not milled finely in that bread. Another thing to consider is you check your salt. If you're using real salt, like Redmond's real salt or the like Celtic sea salt, you do know that it's not as fine as your typical, store-bought iodized salt. And so it is possible, depending on what you're baking, that maybe it didn't dissolve enough and you have a little bit of that grit from the salt. I do think it's predominantly from not milling the grains fine enough. I think that's the main issue to focus on first. Make sure you mill fine enough. Just adjust those stones where you have that fine flour coming out. Alrighty. So those are the main issues that I see that I get questions about. Let us look at the questions that I have. Okay, we have Chalkmart. How does adding gluten affect bread? I actually recommend seeing I think it was my last video. Yeah, the bread additives video. And I talk about different additives and how it affects the bread. But bottom line, gluten, adding additional gluten to the bread, it is to help it rise more. That's the main thing of adding gluten. The reason why many people say to add it to breads with freshly milled wheat is because they state that that bran can cut into the gluten strands, kind of prohibiting the rise a little bit. So adding that extra gluten gives it a bit of oomph. Personally, I don't use it. I haven't found that I need it, but that's how it affects the bread. Just giving it a little bit of extra oomph there to help it to rise. Okay, so let me see. I know we had another question here and I missed it. Okay, do you ever make sourdough bread? Do you have a sourdough starter? I've had great success with my starter. Born 11/20/20. That's great. I still am experimenting with my own sourdough. The difficulty it is more difficult, but I will tell you that I have had more success with sourdough breads with 100% fresh and milled wheat with a starter that is old. Whenever I have made my own starter and I was using it, it was still fairly new. Oh, the bread's not really good. So I do recommend you have an old starter that's really going to help. Like Lynette's, she's had one since 2020. That's a really good starter that you have. That's a nice old starter. I actually bought my starter from Azure Standard. So, and that has been my best starter. It's already well established. You just have to get it going again. But that's really great. There are other starters that you can buy, or if you have a friend with a good starter who can give you some, that's great as well. But I have found that it does work considerably better with an older starter. So that's something to consider with that. Okay, another question from Lynn. How long will yeast last in the fridge or on the shelf? Okay, very good question, because especially from a prepping mindset, this is extremely important. So there are a few things you need to consider with yeast. One, is your yeast vacuum sealed? I know that the Fleischmann's yeast that I buy at Sam's in bulk, that is a vacuumed sealed yeast that will definitely last longer on the shelf than yeast, say, from Azure Standard and other places that do not vacuum seal their yeast. With those, anything that is not vacuum sealed, I keep in my freezer to really help prolong the life. I go through so much of it. I've never had yeast go bad. But even when I wasn't baking as much bread when I first started, so long as I kept the yeast in the fridge, I mean, it would last easily 6 months or probably more. I was using it within 6 months. So I do know that any opened yeast, non-vacuum sealed yeast, I do recommend storing in the freezer to really help it last longer. Okay, how to get 100% whole wheat to rise good. Mine just seems heavy. Susan, I don't know if you just joined, but we did discuss dense bread and bread not rising earlier in this video. So I do recommend checking that out. Okay, so had another question. What does oil and honey do in bread? Oil, that's actually a good question. I'm not entirely sure the scientific reason for using oil. I do know with honey, it does two things. One, it sweetens the bread a bit, but I have noticed my bread turns out softer when I'm using honey than whenever I do not use it. Okay, so we have another question. I have Zorushi Virtuoso Plus. Yay, that is a bread machine. I really want to adopt your recipe for 2-pound loaf. Can you make suggestions on recipe and bread machine settings? Okay, so a little confession here. I'm about to receive my own Zorushi Virtuoso Plus. I have no experience personally with bread machines, but I have one coming so I can actually answer these questions, because a lot of y'all have been asking me about the bread machine settings lately, and I can't really help y'all out because I don't know from experience. So when I get it, experiment with it, definitely watch out for a video. I will be doing that for y'all. All right, so I think we got all the questions. We've been on here for a while. So thank y'all so very much for y'all joining me on this Thursday. We switched it up this time, a Thursday evening. If you have missed the beginning of the video where we talked about different bread issues, feel free to start over to see if there's any questions answered that you would like answered. And as always, I really appreciate y'all being here. And I hope that y'all have a wonderful rest of your evening or day if you're in Australia, apparently. And I will see y'all next video or the next live stream. Bye.